So let's talk about the anchor point. What in the world is an anchor point? So if we select a clip, I'm just going to click it here in the program monitor to make its bounding box active. This little circle with the plus in it, that is the anchor point. So then why is that significant? The anchor point is significant because all transformations occur around this point. So if I open up motion and rotate, the rotation happens around this anchor point. However, if I move the anchor point, which seems like it's moving the layer, but it's actually moving the anchor point on the layer. Notice the position is staying the same because the anchor point is still in the same position relative to the upper left-hand corner of the sequence. So I am going to hold shift, make this happen a little bit faster for you. And if I put the anchor point, the bottom right-hand corner of the movie clip, let me drag the movie clip to realign that here, and now rotate it, it rotates around the anchor point, or in other words, the bottom right-hand corner of the clip here. Now I'm going to undo this a bunch of times here until we get about to where we were. Actually, that's exactly where we were before. And let's try animating the anchor point. So I'll click the stopwatch for anchor point. I want it to be here at this point. And then at this point, I want this to be front and center. It's a little bit off center now. So if I click and move this around here, again using shift to speed the process along. Make that the center point. Looks good. And also, for the first time, we're going to scale an additional property. Now, this sounds really cool, and it is, but it's really not that big of a deal. All you have to do is just animate another property the same way you would regularly. So I'm going to go back to frame 0. Let's animate scale. Animate this down. Scale this down. And I'm going to go back to about 1 second in, or to where this UFO blows up. And let's scale this back up. Even a little bit more, probably. So now what's going to happen is the clip is going to go back to home here. It's going to start from the center and start smaller, and it's going to get bigger. But as it's going to get bigger, it's going to shift so that the UFO becomes the center focus. Let's play that back. Very interesting. This is actually a very common use for anchor point. While you're scaling something up or zooming into a photo or a movie clip, you animate the anchor point to change the focus. This is especially common when doing Ken Burns style documentaries. Now, Ken Burns did a lot of PBS documentaries, and he was famous for this technique wherein he videotaped a photo and he would actually move the camera into certain characters, and it really had a way of breathing life into documentaries. Now, it's really hard to find a decent documentary that doesn't use this great Ken Burns technique. Now, because we're going to be changing the anchor point in the Ninja Death logo, we're going to save changing the anchor point on the logo items until the end of the chapter. In the next segment, we're going to take a look at altering and animating opacity. This next effect, opacity, you'll probably use all the time. Opacity is essentially the opposite of transparency. When a clip is at 100% opacity, that means it's completely opaque or not see-through. When the opacity is set to 0%, it means it is completely transparent or completely see-through. So let's select a clip and open up opacity. Now you'll notice that opacity is separate than motion. Because there's no movement associated with opacity, it's in a category all its own. Now opacity is a little bit more tricky than the others. The stopwatch for opacity has already been set for you. But even though the stopwatch is set for you, no keyframes have been set for you. So no keyframes are actually set until you type in a value here or scrub to it. So if we want to fade this clip in, I could simply click here and type 0 and hit enter. Go in a little bit, type 100 here. And now if I hit home and preview, it has a nice little fade in. Now you'll notice that there's some weird stuff going on here in the timeline that we haven't seen before. This yellow line is called the rubber band. We'll look a little bit more at the rubber band in the next chapter when we talk about remapping time. Suffice it to say, the rubber band is another way to change a value. Keyframes are indicated by these little diamond shapes here. We can actually click and drag these keyframes and move them around. And we can actually click here in this rubber band, and when our cursor goes over it, you see that we get this up and down arrow. Well, if I click and drag, right now our opacity is at 100%, but if I drag down, you'll see that I'm changing the opacity this way. So if I let go now, you'll see the opacity of our clip reduced to 61.53%. I'll take this back to 100 here. The reason why we're seeing this rubber band do stuff, get keyframes and move around a little bit when we're adjusting opacity, and we didn't see that with the other properties, is because by default, this is set to show the rubber band for opacity. Premiere assumes that you will probably use the opacity transform the most. To change the rubber band, we can click on this where it says opacity, opacity, and change to either motion, opacity, or timer mapping, which we haven't talked about quite yet. So if I went to motion, scale, then when I clicked this rubber band and moved it up, I'd actually be scaling the clip up, or if I clicked it down, we'd be scaling it down. So that might be a more convenient way for you to do it. It's completely your preference. And there's also yet another way to adjust keyframes, and that's if we click this little chevron here to expand our keyframe area. Now again, if it's pointed to the right here, you notice that I'm actually seeing the timeline area. Pointed to the left, you'll see that it's closed up. So if you're not seeing this area and it's completely closed up, then just click this chevron again. Now if you're seeing this, where you have a right-facing chevron and nothing here on the right-hand side, it's because there's not enough room for you to see the timeline here in the Effect Controls panel. So simply give a little bit more room there by expanding the interface. And there we have a separate timeline that mimics this timeline, only gives us more control over our keyframes. We can click and drag and move these around and so forth. We're going to cover more of these advanced animation features in the Beyond the Basics training series. I'm actually going to go close up this chevron here, drag this closed. And there's actually one thing I want to show you here before we leave opacity, and I want to use video. In the next chapter, we're going to look at this really cool clip of Thor rising from the dead. But I want to use it here as well. So I've copied it also to the Chapter 6 folder. So let's go ahead and open that up. And let's drag this to our timeline. And I'm going to chop this a little bit. That looks good. When his hands come up, that looks good. Now I'm going to trim that. And let's click and drag this and move this back to frame 0. Hit the home key. Now both of these clips are from Plan 9 from Outer Space, so they work really well together. The thing is, once I brought in the Thor clip, I can't see the UFO clip. So with the Thor clip selected, I can come up here to opacity and reduce good old Thor's opacity here till we can see the UFO clip underneath. Now we're not seeing that because remember we animated the opacity of this clip to fade in from the beginning. So if I click and drag on this keyframe, bring it all the way to the top, then we'll see the UFO underneath. And actually, let me click on our original clip and take down scale back to 100%. There we go. That's looking pretty cool. Maybe I could come back to the Thor clip and bump up the opacity just a little bit more. Very good. Now let's hit home and play this. Now that looks like a 60s sci-fi classic right there. Now very briefly, let's jump over to our Ninja Death title and let me show you a little trick that you can use when animating opacity. Now I actually want to fade in very quickly Ninja, then Death, then 3. So here's the way to do that. I want my Ninja word to fade in at about 15 frames in. So I'm going to select Ninja, come over to opacity, and then just retype 100%. Again, the stopwatch has already been clicked for you on the opacity property, but no keyframes have been set. So just by retyping 100 and hitting enter, we force it to set a keyframe for opacity at this frame. I'm going to move, I don't know, about 10 frames down the road here to Death. And set a keyframe for that for 100% at this frame as well. And move another 10 frames down the road. That'll be about a second and 5 frames in. And let's take the opacity again to 100. Hit enter. Now I'm going to come back to frame 0, select the Ninja layer, and change the opacity to 0 so it starts fading in. Then I'm going to come about 5 frames in and select the death layer, and then change opacity to 0. Now, why wouldn't I start opacity at 0 at frame 0 for the death layer? Well, as soon as the current time indicator leaves the keyframe, it's going to start interpolating to the next value. I don't want death to start fading in until the word ninja is already fading in. So then, I'm going to hit the right arrow 5 times, maybe 10 times. Then, I'm going to select the 3 layer, and I'm going to set the opacity for 0 here. So now I'm going to hit the home key and preview what we have so far. Oops, I think I forgot to set a keyframe for the letter 3. I might have been on the wrong layer here. So let's just go ahead and fix that real quick by typing 100 here. Preview that again. Oh yeah, Ninja Death 3. Oh, very nice, very nice. Now keep in mind, the farther away keyframes are, the longer it takes to get from point A to point B, so it's going to be a slower animation. Think if you were going from LA to Chicago. If you went there in 4 hours, you'd have to go there very, very quickly. If you went there in 27 hours, you can take your time and go a little bit slower. Same thing with animation. You're going from point A to point B, but the speed is determined by how far it has to go in the given time. So we've talked about a lot in this chapter, and in the next segment, we're going to put everything together and give a quick little animation treatment to our logo here and basically incorporate all that we've learned. Let's go check that out. It's going to be really fun. Really fun.